It's a continuation of a message I did here a couple of weeks ago, and I know in this sermon series we're unpacking those elements from Luke 15. So I'll rehash a little bit, and for those of you that weren't here, that'll be good. But even those of you that were new, we're going to add a new element to this sermon today as we're looking at this entire passage. In preparation for this, I did a lot of research on sheep, but this is years ago as well. But knowing I was going to be preaching again, I kind of leaned back in with some of my sources. I wanted to learn what it really means to be a shepherd, because this sermon is about what it means to be a sheep. But in researching this, I also realized we're also called to be shepherds. Now, that doesn't mean you're called to be a pastor by title, but that's actually what the word pastor means in its archaic form, is to shepherd. And so we're called to shepherd, and we're called to minister to people in a way. So I want to take you somewhere different today, maybe challenge your heart a little bit. And in doing this, I realized I have a dog named Duke, and we always wanted to know his breed when we got him because he was a little fur ball. And they said, well, he's this kind of dog. Have you ever adopted a pet? And you took the pet home and you're like, I don't think this is what it's supposed to be. This looks like a wolf, not a dog. I think we thought we had adopted a jackal. He kind of became kind of crazy and wild. And then as he got older, we started to see his breed sort of come up, rise up, his physical qualities. He's a shepherd. He's a Dutch shepherd, and if you don't know anything about dogs have a hard time breaking from their breed. So different types of dogs, and nowadays, all the dog has been bred out of a lot of these things I see walking around New York City. Like sometimes I'm not sure it's a dog. It looks like a large rat with fur. But in any case, a shepherd has a really hard time breaking away from its DNA, the DNA that God gave it. And shepherds do several things. They provide, which he is not able to do at all. Fortunately, he doesn't hunt because he barks all the time. But he does protect. Like an uncanny sense of the boundaries of his property. We used to live in Nashville, Tennessee, and had a big yard. And as soon as I'd open the door, he would just charge, and he would disappear behind the bushes, and he would just run around the yard to the perimeter, and then he would spend his time out there doing whatever he wanted to do, playing around. But he still does that. In New York, we have a much smaller footprint. We don't really have a yard. We have a fence outside of our steps. And so as soon as we walk out, he walks the perimeter. Wherever we go walking, he checks the perimeter of the park, wherever the park it is he's used to. And then we come back, he understands commands very well. So I'll say patrol, and he does the perimeter, sniffing around the outside, and he comes back to the door and he's ready to go in. And when I am gone and my wife is there, he steps into ultra shepherd mode. Like he'll growl at anything. It's crazy because when I come home, he collapses in fatigue because he's been so on edge protecting my wife, especially if I'm out of town. Sometimes I'll preach somewhere else or leave town for 2 or 3 days. And he is just the whole time wired because that's who he is. That's who he's made to be. And so that's been hard for me as a pastor in sort of realizing my job, one of my jobs as a pastor is to protect, to provide, and to guide. And in becoming a pastor, I've also forgotten that I'm still a sheep. And I want us to think about that today as we go through this passage, that we are in both positions. In your life, you're in both positions. And I will unpack the gospel for you in a minute. I don't know if you're a guest here or you're new. We believe wholeheartedly that God is our King, that Jesus, his son, is the physical representation of God on earth, and he is the good shepherd, the great shepherd. And we submit our lives to him. So we are sheep, but he also gives all of us, not just pastors by name, all of us, the responsibility of shepherding others, which is difficult to do when you still look at yourself as a sheep. So I'm speaking to two groups of people today, and all of us are in both of these groups. The posture of your heart, what you've been through recently, what you're going through in your life, your relationship with Christ, you may look at yourself as one or the other. I'm really a sheep. I've been lost. And I want to unpack the scripture. We'll see how that plays out. But also, if you are in Christ, if you have given your life to Christ, you've decided, hey, I want to seek God. You have to realize that at some point you'll be transitioning to not just a sheep, but also a shepherd. And it's very hard to do both, but it's necessary for us as believers. So let's look at this passage from Luke chapter 15. I want to read through the whole thing just so, because I like to teach and read, and I'm going to come back to some stuff, but I just want to read through this. And I want us to remember what I told you a couple weeks ago. And if you weren't here, These passages have been used through the years in a very powerful way to transform hearts and to transform lives. The first parable of the lost coin, the first parable is about the lost sheep. The second parable is about the lost coin. The third parable is about the prodigal son. And pastors say that, and some Bibles like mine actually have it in the title. Those weren't written in by the author or by God, but it helps us to find those stories. But as I illustrated, those stories were really not intended for the lost sheep, the lost coins, the prodigal sons. This whole passage that I'm about to read you was intended for the Pharisees. Jesus was addressing the Pharisees. It even says he said these things for them. It doesn't mean we're not in the story. I want you to find yourself in the story. I want you to find yourself in this story as the lost coin that God would come after if he lost you because you're valuable. You're way more valuable than one piece of silver. I want you to see yourself as the lost sheep. You should. He comes after us. We sing songs about that all the time. Reckless love. He leaves the 99 and comes for the one. And I want you to see yourself as the prodigal son, but you also have to see yourself as the Pharisee in this story, who having received the grace, who having been found, has to be willing to turn around and look for another lost coin, to look for another lost sheep, and to look for another younger brother. So, as we read this story, wherever you find yourself, ask God to speak to your heart. Then all the tax collectors and sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So he spoke this parable to them, saying, "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost.' I say to you that likewise there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just persons who need no repentance." So he opens up this whole section and he's speaking about the sheep. And I want you to keep that in mind, because this is our focus today. It's on the sheep section. I'm going to quickly read through the coin and through the prodigal son. But I want you to consider he was speaking to the Pharisees and he's speaking about sheep, first of all. So then he goes to this section. "Or what woman having 10 silver coins," and we also know that the Pharisees were, I say I'm not going to stop, but I can't help it. The Pharisees were somewhat smitten with money and with control and with power. So he goes from sort of an illustration of sheep in the fields to something that they might have actually just dealt with in their synagogue. And we see this when Jesus later on flips the tables. He just flips the tables and he says, you guys are looking at the wrong things. And so sometimes that's the case with us. God likes to flip the tables of our heart when we look at the wrong things. So he says this to them. She loses a coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it. And when she has found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the piece which I lost. Likewise, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." He's bringing up again, this is not about silver and coins. This is about people and hearts. And finally, the parable of the lost son. Then he said, "A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided them to his livelihood, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living." Again, I did this sermon a couple weeks ago. If you don't know the story, please read it. Spend some time on it this week, but I want to go to the end, which is the interaction between the older brother and the father. Now his older son was in the field. The son had squandered away all his living, was eating with pigs, and realized he had to come home, and he was welcomed home by his loving dad. And as he came to draw near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to them, "Your brother has come, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf." But he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered and said to his father, "Lo, these many years I've been serving you. I've never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you were always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. This story is a great hinge story, taking almost all of the Old Testament and bringing it forward to the New Testament, and this is why. Go with me back in history a little bit now. I won't read all of these passages, but I want to give you some references throughout biblical history, starting in the garden, referencing to how God has carefully placed shepherds amongst his people. The first one, Abel. Genesis chapter 4, verse 12. The second son of Adam and Eve, the younger brother, the second born. Cain was the older brother. Cain was, he worked the fields with his hands and apparently didn't present God the best. Abel comes along, who was a man of sheep and cattle, and gave him a good offering. It says even that passage, including the fatty part. Well, that's the good part if you've ever had burned ends at a barbecue place. Whew. I was in Texas last week. I had to make up for lost time, but I digress. So he was a shepherd. He was murdered by his brother, but one of the first positions in humanity, and this is important to understand. A nation's wealth, historically, up literally until possibly the conglomeration of governments producing most of our food, the wealth of a land was illustrated, the wealth of a country was illustrated by its livestock. So, and what does livestock imply? Livestock implies land, because in order for livestock, cow, sheep, goats, they need land. If you've ever had a goat, it needs a lot of land. In Tennessee, people got into adopting little goats, and there are goats all over the place, and they realized, hey, we don't need a lawnmower because the goat eats everything. So it takes a lot to man sheep, and to man goats, and to man cattle. And throughout history, it's represented the wealth of a nation. So it's a very important job, but it's also one of the jobs that's looked down upon the most. The Bedouin shepherds, who have been around literally for millennia, have been around since the time of Christ and before, possibly even carry on the early shepherding skills implemented by some other shepherds I'm about to tell you about. They live as nomads. They live in tents. They have very little wealth, but they manage great wealth. And a few shepherds, as they sometimes go through their generations, are able to attain wealth for themselves and become their own shepherds, and then they end up hiring other shepherds beneath them. But the reason I'm telling you this is because all throughout history, we see God placing shepherds throughout Scripture. Let's look at some more. That was the first one. That was Abel. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the triad, the trifecta, our patriarchs, all shepherds. All had great amounts of land. Now, how they got it, there's all kinds of great stories in that if you read the Old Testament. Genesis 13 tells us about their shepherding. 26, chapter 30 tells us about it. There's even a shepherdess. I don't know if you know the story of Rachel. She was a shepherdess. We can read about her in Genesis 29. And one of my favorite stories of shepherding comes when, after several generations, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's 11 sons were shepherds also, except for perhaps Joseph, who maybe didn't have to do as much work as his brothers. We kind of read that in that story as well in Genesis. I really encourage you to read this story because it sets up God's people for generations, an indicator that truly the wealth is in the shepherding. So the land is going through famine in Egypt. Do you know the story? Joseph was sold into slavery by his older brothers. There's the older brother picture again. Sold into slavery to some Ishmaelites that sold him to Potiphar. In Potiphar's house, Potiphar was the captain of the Egyptian guard. And Joseph, because he really did love God, he really did have a heart for him, maintained his faith even in prison. He was actually in the house of Potiphar. He was sort of framed and put in prison and continued to maintain his faith because while in prison, the cupbearer and the baker of the Pharaoh, he interpreted their dreams, that he found favor with the Pharaoh. Joseph became the most powerful person really on the planet at that time. He became Pharaoh's right-hand man. Knowing that famine was coming because of those crazy dreams, he told the Pharaoh, hey, you need to plan ahead. He found favor with him. He said, listen, things are going to be rough. In the meantime, Jacob and his brothers were dealing with famine in Canaan. Lo and behold, they come to Egypt. They grovel before their brother. They didn't know it was their brother at that time. They thought he was just a guard of the Pharaoh. He was basically almost fully Egyptian at that point. He'd been married. He had 2 Egyptian sons. So he looks like an Egyptian. They didn't recognize him. And they ask him for food because Egypt was wealthy. And so this whole story, I won't go through the whole story of Joseph, but he forgives them. They have a reunion, and he brings Jacob back to Egypt and reunites with his father, Jacob, the shepherd. And the first thing he does is he goes to Pharaoh. He goes, hey, my family, we really know how to take care of sheep and cattle and things like that. Will you let us take care of Egypt's cattle? In other words, God was positioning a shepherd to manage the wealth of Egypt. And it was that way for 400 years. Now, at the end of that story, we have a young man it was a time where they were starting to realize, hey, these people, these Hebrews are starting to outnumber us. There's a little fear there. So they wanted to make it difficult on them. They basically went from being bondservants to all-out slaves. And so during this time, God sent a deliverer, Moses, you know that story too, put him in the basket. This is generations after Joseph. Joseph lived through 5 pharaohs, so his name was known in Egypt until the next pharaoh came that forgot his name, and the next pharaoh. Before you know it, we don't even know who these people are. We don't know who Joseph is. It wouldn't have made sense for the Egyptians to give this foreigner credit for saving the country, so you don't see his name, although it does pop up now in archaeological finds every now and then. But we see the Pharaoh starts to panic, and he sends out an edict that all the young boys should be killed. So Moses' mother puts him in a basket. He becomes a prince of Egypt. If you see the movie, I don't know why I called him that. That's not what he's called in the Bible, but he becomes a son of the Pharaoh for 40 years. I don't want to embarrass anybody. Just raise your hand internally if you're over 40 and you feel like, well, if that happened to me, so you're pointing to your parents. That's great. So at the age of 40, when I was thinking in my life, I'm starting to, okay, where am I going to retire? You know, in a couple decades, God's woken me up since then. I'm not retiring, but that's when we're doing at that stage of our life. He spent 40 years learning the politics, the culture of Egypt, and then God sent him away. He actually had murdered one of the slave masters, and he kind of went away for protection. And where did he go? To the wilderness to become a shepherd. He left the wealth of Egypt. He spent 40 years in the wilderness and spent 40 years learning how to walk. Imagine going from that household where you have everything you want, at least at that time, to going and living in caves and walking around the field and sleeping outside at night. What God was doing during that time was waking up his heart. He became a shepherd, not of people yet, but of sheep, of things that he realized these are important to almost any civilization and culture. He learned how to be a shepherd. He learned how to protect them. He would have learned how to keep animals away. He would have learned their eating cycles. He would have learned how to go after the one when he gets lost and what a snare is. You know what a snare is? We sing that, dangers, toils, and snares. Is that Amazing Grace? Many dangers. You know what a snare is? Well, shepherds would set snares for wolves and for bad animals along walking paths. So they knew that they wanted their sheep to stay near them because sometimes the sheep would also get caught in those snares. So that's where we get that word from. So he would have learned how to set snares, probably how to pull sheep out of snares. And then at the age of 80 years old. Now, maybe his physiology was different. It probably was back then because people did live longer in our view of the Bible. People were much healthier and lived a lot. The further away we get from the garden, the further away we get from Eden, the more broken we've become over the centuries. And so he was still 80 years old. He went back to Egypt to become a different kind of shepherd. So you know the story of Moses. He spent 40 years as an actual shepherd of sheep to prepare himself for becoming a shepherd of God's people. And what helped Moses, and we read about this in one of the Psalms, is that he never forgot what it was to be a shepherd or to be a sheep. So the next one is one of my favorites, King David. Obviously, we can read about him throughout the Old Testament. There's a lot of references to him in the New Testament. He was sort of held up as the epitome of kings. In fact, our belief as Christians that he was probably the only really good king, which is ironic. He was a man after God's own heart, but he also was a murderer. That's pretty crazy that God could redeem somebody that does that. And then maybe that's a message for you. No matter what you've done in your life, no matter what you've done, God can redeem you. And he will redeem you if you ask. That was a digression, but I wanted you to know that somebody needs to hear that. So in this story, we see David spending almost his entire childhood as a what? as a shepherd to Jesse, his father. His brothers, they were shepherds too. Of course, they were fighting in the army as well. But David was a shepherd. Why is that important? Because he would become the first official shepherd of God's people. What about Saul? Saul was also a shepherd, but not a good one. And not only played out in his life, it played out in the kingdom of Israel as he tried to kill David a couple times. David understood what it meant to be a sheep and a shepherd. Throughout his life, he dealt with both of those topics. He was hunted by Saul. He was hunted by his enemies. We read about this all throughout the Psalms. In a moment, I'm going to close and read Psalm 23 for you. David understood the value of being both a sheep and a shepherd. So let's talk about sheep just a little bit. Have you ever heard that sheep are stupid? I mean, I've been around sheep, especially in Tennessee. We would visit friends who had them. They're not really stupid, and actually, once they get to know you, they can be very bright. This is why sheep look stupid, because they're fearful, which is sometimes why we look stupid. I'm going to say we. I could say you. It's without a doubt. There are times in my life when I let the fears of my heart keep me from doing what God has called me to do or going where God has called me to go because I'm fearful. That's why over and over and over again, God doesn't say, don't be fearful. He says, do not fear on occasion, but he doesn't want you to try to get rid of all your fear. He wants you to aim your fear at him. He's the one we should be afraid of. And I don't know if you've ever heard that before. And you probably, if you're new here or you're a young believer or you're not even a believer, that sounds like a weird phrase. Why should we be afraid of God? Isn't he loving? Yes, he is loving. And we should also be afraid of him. Not that he can kill us, but that he could and he won't. It doesn't mean don't be afraid of him because I know he's not going to hurt me. No, I'm fearful of the Lord because if I fall outside of his fold, if I walk away from the flock, there's going to be a price to pay. And I don't know what the price is, but I know this. When a sheep wanders from a flock, one thing the shepherd does, and this is true, they really will leave the sheep because those sheep will probably stay together. If he leaves the flock, because again, sheep by nature are fearful, so their number one instinct, the thing that's hard for them to break from, is going around other sheep, is to be around other sheep. But as soon as a sheep is isolated, it becomes incredibly fearful. It starts that meh thing, and shepherds could hear it in the distance. Often shepherds wouldn't know that their sheep had wandered until they hear that sound in the distance. And they would go and find it. And this is what a shepherd would do. Sometimes if it was caught in a snare or if it had been injured, the shepherd would place it over its shoulders. But even when it wasn't, the shepherd would place it over its shoulders anyway, because then he was going to train that sheep to stay with him. And even if the sheep wasn't injured, he would continue to carry it, sometimes for a day, sometimes for 2 days if it was small enough. And that sheep became accustomed to not only being around him, his smell, his motions, his actions. If you're ever near sheep, don't make a sudden move because it scares them. Things that move suddenly scare them. You have to move gently and slowly. And so he would carry that sheep, and this is the one thing that the sheep would learn. The sound of a shepherd's voice. It is very simple to be a Christian in understanding what it takes. It's hard to actually implement it in your life. This is how you get, this is how you get close to God. This is how you start to walk with the Lord. You spend time with him. You get to know what his voice sounds like. And in order for you to do that, you have to get away from the greater flock of our culture. Our culture is full of flocks. It's full of tribes. It's full of political groups. It's full of social groups. Some of those are good. Some of those are bad, but none of them offer you hope. Spend time. And this isn't about coming to church every Sunday. This is one of the best places you could be. This is one of the safest, best places you can be, but it's not perfect. Churches have warts. Pastors are not perfect shepherds, but this is one of the best places you can be. But the absolute best place you need to spend most of your time is with the good shepherd, with the Lord. How do you do that? You might have to, and this doesn't mean you're leaving the flock when you go in isolation. You're not leaving a spiritual flock. You're leaving a physical flock that takes our ears, it takes our eyes, it takes our hearts, it distracts us. Spend time with the Lord one-on-one. two primary ways you do this. I know this is simple. I just said it's simple to be a Christian. It's hard to do it. So I'm going to give you some things to help you do it. But I know this because when I go and speak at conferences, I speak at a lot of parenting conferences and marriage conferences. And the one thing I tell parents is this thing. You've got to do these two things consistently with your kids. From the moment that they start hearing speech, which is the moment they're born, you start reading the Bible to them, and then eventually with them, and then eventually they read it on their own. And then you also pray over them, you pray with them, and then eventually they pray on their own. Parents, if you're a parent here of young kids, or even if you have teenagers, if you haven't been doing it, confess, repent, tell your kids you're sorry, start praying together, start reading the Bible together. And in your life as a believer, I know this is simple, but let me ask you, how much time a day do you spend isolated from the culture, from the world around us, with the Lord in prayer? This is not a legalistic statement that you have to do it 15 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day. You've got to do this. Don't check those boxes. Check your heart. Do you want to hear from the Lord? This isn't a box checking moment. This is a chance for you to truly ask yourself, am I hungry for him? Am I hungry? Am I searching for those waters of life that he says he'll give us if we just ask? Are you going to the waters? What are the waters? Prayer and Scripture, his word. So I'm going to challenge you. Look at how much time you've spent with the Lord this week. And it's not like if you have a job and you don't do anything at the very end of the week, you cram in 10 hours of work in the last day. This should be something that you establish as a rhythm in your life. That's why God gives us the Sabbath. Not that you have to do a particular thing on Sunday or on Sabbath or rest and then go to church on Sunday. Those schedules are great. The point is you should have a schedule. You should have a rhythm in your life. There should be a time every day that you dedicate to talking to the Lord. And have a standby. Hey, sometimes stuff comes up, but we don't have a standby. So, I didn't pray yesterday. Before you know it, you know how it is. It's the drift. The drift that I talked about a couple weeks ago. It starts with one miss, and before you know it, I haven't prayed deeply in weeks. And then, you know this, then you find yourself in a bind and you feel guilty because you're coming to God for the first time in a week or in a month or maybe in years. And you're like, God, I know I haven't been talking to you. The beautiful thing about the Lord is you can still come to him. He will take you in every time, no matter how long you've been away. But you also should really try to establish that cycle, that Sabbath in your life where you're spending time with it. I'm about to brag, right? No, I'm telling you, I set this up. I'm not very good at being faithful to it, but I have a schedule in my day, and my day actually begins after dinner at night. I know that sounds weird. That's a whole nother sermon, but my wife and I have started dedicating time to him that we never really did before. At night, which to us is the beginning of the day, it sets our hearts right before we go to bed. And then the middle of the day, this is confusing, don't worry about it. It's, again, another sermon. In the morning when we wake up, we consider that the middle of the day. We do it again. We check our hearts again. In the week, it should be the same way. You should check your heart today. It's Sunday. We're worshiping together. Midway through the week, check yourself. How are you doing? Are you spending time with the Lord? And the second thing that I tell all parents, and I tell you now, spend time in his word. As archaic as some of those passages in Leviticus may sound, find out why they sound archaic to you. Maybe there's a deeper meaning that we don't understand culturally that meant something back then. Or maybe we're just looking at a picture of God and his people that we can learn from. Why do they have so many rules? When we get into those bizarre stories in the Old Testament where if you don't understand who God is, he looks like a mass murderer from time to time. But in almost every situation, you'll see that there was great evil that he was trying to take out for his own people, for his own children. So I encourage you, read his word, pray on a regular basis, and read his word on a regular basis. Those two things will allow you to understand, to recognize God's voice. Because in the coming days, in the coming years, and in your life, however long we're here, the enemy is going to whisper other thoughts and other words into your ears. And you have to understand which ones are from God and which ones are from the enemy. Because sometimes they sound very close. Sometimes they sound very similar. But you have to understand who God is. You have to understand that not only are you a sheep, but God is expecting great things from you as shepherds. So I want to close and read Psalm 23. You can turn to that. I'll read that in just a minute. Jesus called himself the Good Shepherd. Jesus also was a lamb. The lamb that was sacrificed for us. We sang in a couple of different songs today about that. He took both positions, but he was perfect in both positions. He was the perfect shepherd. He was also the only one that could be the pure and spotless lamb. We're supposed to take both of those positions as well. And you're going to be imperfect in that journey. That's why you have a good relationship with God. That's why you're supposed to lean on him to understand what it means to be a sheep and a shepherd at the same time. David understood this as a former shepherd and then as a shepherd of God's people. And so he wrote this beautiful psalm that you've all read about. I want to unpack it just a little bit. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. That statement alone declares that you're a sheep. Right? If you read this psalm, if the Lord is your shepherd, it implies that you're a sheep. It implies that you are fearful. It implies that you have the ability to roam, or the propensity to roam. We like to wander. We like to do our own thing a lot. It fully identifies you as a sheep that needs a flock, that needs to be around others. Now, if you're not in fellowship in your life with other believers, I would encourage you to do that. That's important. It's not quite as important as spending time in the Word and spending time with the Lord in prayer, but you should be in fellowship. We're made to be in fellowship. You might be an introvert and might not like it as much. You might be an extrovert, and that's awesome for you. But in both cases, you need a group of people that are like-minded in their faith. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't have friends that are not believers at all. In fact, I encourage you, but don't do that alone either, because that can be really challenging and tempting when we're the only believer in a crowd of non-believers. But definitely make friends. How else will we tell people about the Lord? How else will we show people who he is if we don't show them a part of our life and let them get to know us and have us get to know them? That's been challenging for me moving to New York. My whole life, I grew up in the South, and the churches that I was involved in after I came to faith always had missionaries, and we would send missionaries to a certain land. Like we had missionaries in Haiti; they had to get out for the sake of their life. We had missionaries in Europe, we had missionaries in Spain, and they would go and spend 2 or 3 years there to get to know the culture, to even kind of get to know the language a little more, and that's how that worked for a long time. But in New York, there's no culture. There's all cultures. Like you can't, it's one of the most difficult things for being a missionary in New York, and for you as believers in New York, we're all missionaries, is that we tend to spend time around the people that are most like us. Now, I don't condemn you in this. It's sort of human nature. They look like me. They talk like me. They like the music I like. That's kind of a natural thing. But as believers, we're called to really get to know other people and to simply love them, regardless of what their culture is, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their socioeconomic status. We're called as believers to embed ourselves in every culture, not to isolate ourselves from it. But you do need fellowship. I love this next one. It doesn't make a lot of sense unless you unpack it. I shall not want. The original language, it says, I shall not be in want. In other words, he'll provide for you. Shepherds provide. They take you to the watering hole. Jesus will guide you to living water. He will guide you to truth. He will guide you to understanding his word. He'll guide you into a closer relationship with him and with others. But you have to trust him. He's going to take care of you. I won't be in want. I shall not want. Verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. Why do you think it says he makes me? He makes me. Because we don't want to sit still, most of us. God sometimes has to make us sit still. Maybe that's you. Maybe you're so busy in your life, you don't take the time to establish those things we've talked about. You don't take the time to establish a good prayer life. You don't take the time to establish time when you read the word because we're so busy. Sometimes it takes a tragedy in your life for God to make you stay by the still waters. And it doesn't always have to be that way. Sometimes he takes us through things we can't help. But don't let your life get to a point where he has to make you stay by his still waters. If you're in a good place now, wherever you are, God, please establish my walk with you, establish my, if you will, my feeding schedule. Don't get to a point where he makes you lie down. It's something that a sheep should do if a shepherd asks him to. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. And then we get into the spiritual. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He leads you in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. What that means, you've heard me, well, maybe you haven't. I forget, I don't preach here a lot. But the fourth commandment, fifth commandment, do not take the Lord's name in vain. That doesn't mean don't cuss. You shouldn't cuss. It means don't take the name of God upon you and not mean it. At the time, for the Old Testament, don't call yourself a Jew if you don't represent Jehovah. Don't call yourself a Christian if you don't represent Jesus. For his name's sake, let him lead you to righteousness. Let him show you how to live your life so that when someone does find out you're a Christian, they go, oh, that makes sense. You're a very kind person. You're very loving. You're full of joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. Those are symbols. Those are signs. Those are fruits in the expression of God's love in your life. That's the righteousness that comes out of you when you spend time with God and you let him lead you as your shepherd. And then it says this, 4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. No one would have understood that more than David as he went into the valley and faced Goliath, representing God's people with what seems like no fear. But he did have fear. Like I said earlier, he just feared the Lord more than any other fear he had. For you, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Why is that important? Why is the rod and staff? We see the rod and the staff all throughout the scriptures as well. We see it represented, the power of God represented by Moses' staff. Moses comes before Pharaoh, who held his staff that represented the will of man and the voice of people. And God confronted the will of man right there with his staff and his rod, representing an entire system of beliefs. David would have carried a staff as well. Ironically, a shepherd's staff, changing over to a king's scepter. That staff represents our shepherd. It represents our lawgiver all in one. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. A shepherd's primary role is to feed, to protect, and to guide. And if you've been going to this church for a while, Gregg has been gone. What I loved about Gregg is, when I first met him, I didn't know any of you, but all he could do is talk about a church. All he could do is talk about it. He really loves this church, loves these people. And that's a good shepherd. A good shepherd loves the people that he cares for. But it's not just the role of a pastor to do that. It's your role as well. We've all been sheep, but maybe it's time in your life that you become a shepherd. And I'm not saying this is your call to ministry. It's your call to minister. We're all called to minister. We're all called to be the hands and the feet of Christ to this world. And so I want to challenge you. Maybe the thing in your life is not just your own faith that's becoming stagnant. Maybe it's that you're not doing what God has called you to do, and that's to help others in their faith and to keep their faith from becoming stagnant. If we're to be the hands and the feet of Christ to others, it's time that we all start shepherding. Shepherd the people in your life. Shepherd the people at work. I know that sounds kind of weird, especially if they don't ask you to shepherd them. You can do it in subtle ways, but I know that God places people in your life when you're ready to do it. The question is, are you ready to hear his voice when he calls you to do it? And that's going to be different for all of us. Some of you are already shepherding people. Some of you are already shepherding groups. Shepherd your heart and shepherd those around you. A shepherd is designed to feed, protect, and guide. You have a dual identity when you're a shepherd, because you also have to remember, like Moses did and like David did, that you're also a sheep. We read about Moses' reflection. Even though Moses had led his people in Psalm 90, he reflects back to God's faithfulness through his years of darkness. And so I want us to do that now as we close in prayer. I want you to think of two things. God, are you coming to get me? Have you felt lost? Have you felt like you're wandering away from God? God is coming to get you right now. And the second thing is, once he gets you, are you ready to start being a shepherd? He wants you to be both in your life.